A continuación, me gustaría presentarles a la doctora Lily Kalmayan, que nos va a hablar sobre Bilingualism differentially impacts cognition among urban and rural dwelling older adults in Mexico. You're very welcome to join us, Dr. Kalmayan.
Hola, gracias a todos. Mi español no es bien, so I'll speak in English. I'm very happy to be here and learn about all the work that's been conducted using thank you, Dr. Wang, for the invitation to speak here today. I am a postdoc working with Dr. Arce Renteria, who you will hear from shortly. And our lab, one of the focuses is understanding bilingualism, how it's measured, and its relationship to cognition and cognitive aging. And so I'll be presenting this work titled Bilingualism Differentially Impacts Cognition Among Urban and Rural Dwelling Older Adults in Mexico. So there is some research that says bilingualism may be related to better cognitive aging and reduced dementia risk. There is some evidence that suggests that bilingual individuals perform better on executive functioning, processing speed, attention, and episodic memory tasks as compared to those who are monolingual. The theories that surround this advantage propose that being bilingual may influence cognition due to the additional language control required to resolve cross-linguistic conflict, which may then strengthen attentional and executive control networks, offering a benefit to overall cognition. Conversely, there are many studies that do not show this cognitive advantage among bilingual individuals. And there are a lot of methodological differences across these studies, as well as how they're measuring bilingualism and operationalizing it. In addition, most of what we know on the relationship between bilingualism and cognitive aging comes from studies in high-income countries, while less is known from low and middle-income countries, where there is a greater prevalence of bilingualism as well as greater linguistic diversity, which you can see in this figure, the difference in the shading from the top and bottom map. Additionally, several studies combine bilingual individuals across the different language groups that they may be speaking. For example, an English-Spanish bilingual adult and an English-Arabic bilingual adult can be grouped in one category. And we know this can be maybe a confound because language is a proxy for various social, cultural, and economic conditions, which we know offer differential impacts on cognitive health. And so this relationship between the socio-cultural confounds and bilingualism is always present in these kinds of studies. And this is particularly important to consider in contexts like Mexico, where bilingual speakers within the same country may use different languages across regions. And Mexico being the 7th or 8th most linguistically diverse nation in the world, this is really important to consider. As you may all know, Spanish is the most widely spoken language throughout the country, but Mexico also has, approximately 7 million speakers of approximately 68 indigenous languages. And most of the Mexican indigenous communities primarily reside in the southern and south central region, and these regions are also more socioeconomically vulnerable areas compared to the overall nation. This map doesn't reflect it, but there are also around 6 million Mexicans who speak English, and they primarily reside in urban settings and more so towards the north. And so there's already plenty of research that shows the established relationship between socioeconomic status and urbanicity on cognition, and it's important to take that into account, particularly in a context like this, where the type of bilingual adult is strongly linked to geography and socio-cultural context. And so our aim was to evaluate whether bilingualism was associated with cognitive performance among Mexican adults. And in order to, again, understand and try to tease apart that sociocultural confound on this relationship, we stratified our results, our analyses, by urban and rural setting, and grouped our sample by the type of bilingual individual. And so we wanted to put that bilingual advantage hypothesis to test because, again, there are proposed cognitive mechanisms that state being bilingual is going to provide an advantage, right? And so, we hypothesized that Spanish, English bilingual adults in urban settings and Spanish indigenous bilingual adults in rural settings would have better cognitive performance compared to their Spanish monolingual counterparts. However, we know that the Spanish indigenous communities are socioeconomically more disadvantaged, And so if there was going to be a bilingual advantage on cognition, it would be a greater benefit would be seen among the Spanish-English bilingual adults rather than the Spanish indigenous group. And so participants were part of the Mexican Health and Aging Study ancillary study on cognitive aging in Mexico, MEXCOG, that Dr. Wang presented on earlier today. And these participants were part of the 2015 MHAS wave, and they were eligible to be selected for MEXCOG using stratified sampling procedures across 8 different Mexican states that oversampled for a variety of different exposures which increase risk for cognitive impairment in older adults. And I used baseline data, so this is the 2016 kind of first cohort of over 2,000 participants that were administered the MEXCOG assessment. And for our analyses, we excluded those who were missing demographic or bilingualism data, and if there was any mismatch in the type of bilingual and context that we're interested in. So for example, there were only 34 Spanish-English bilingual individuals living in rural settings. So it was a small proportion of this mismatch that we excluded. Our final sample amounted to about 92% of the overall MEXCOG sample. In terms of measures, so bilingualism is assessed via self-report and only once upon entering the MHAS study. So participants are asked, do you speak English? And do you speak an indigenous dialect or language? And responses were used to make 3 categories of our participants that you see here, and the Spanish monolinguals were our reference group across our analyses. Locality size was collected based on the standard community population, density cut points, and then recoded into this urban and rural categorization. And then we also had socio-demographic factors that were all collected via self-report. In terms of the cognitive outcomes, MEXCOG is a much more comprehensive assessment of cognition. It's a longer battery with more measures across different cognitive abilities, and they're administered to all the participants in MEXCOG. So our team developed these cognitive factor scores using confirmatory factor analyses, so you can see how we created the 5 domains, and for these analyses, I focused on memory, language, and executive functioning as separate independent outcomes. And so here I'm showing the demographic characteristics for the overall sample in the column on the left, and then stratified by setting, so we can see maybe some group differences in the stratified by setting and bilingual monolingual group. And everything was we used the sampling weights so that our results would be weighted back up to be nationally representative. So in urban settings, we can see that Spanish-English bilingual participants were younger, they were more educated, and they had higher rates of history of migration to the US. And though literacy rates were statistically different between these 2 groups, you can see that the vast majority of individuals living in urban settings reported being literate. In rural settings, on the right side, you can see there were no differences in age, sex, and level of education, though we can see that those living in the rural settings had 2 to 3 years of education, which is much lower than those in urban settings. But in this group, Spanish monolingual participants had higher rates of migration history to the US, and both groups reported substantially lower rates of literacy as compared to those in urban settings, and this was significantly lowest among the Spanish indigenous group. So now showing our main results, which were conducted using individual weighted linear regression models, again, per cognitive domain. And these are, again, stratified by region, controlling for group differences. So we'll start with the urban setting, which, again, we're comparing the Spanish-English bilinguals to the Spanish monolingual participants. And we can see across memory, language, and executive functioning, there was no difference in cognitive performance across those 3 domains. When we look in the rural settings, the Spanish indigenous bilingual participants had lower scores across memory, language, and executive functioning compared to their Spanish monolingual counterparts. And so given these findings in the rural setting, there was no advantage. It was actually they were performing lower across these domains. We wanted to understand if results in the indigenous group were impacted by their literacy status. And this led to some exploratory analysis that was among rural participants. I got a message here. That was among rural participants with less than or equal to 5 years of education, stratified by literacy. And this was done because the median education for this group was 0 years, and so we wanted to reduce any confounding impact of having any level of education, so we made that cut point. And so among those Spanish indigenous bilingual individuals in this setting who were literate, we see that same pattern. So they are still performing lower across these 3 domains compared to their Spanish monolingual counterparts. However, among illiterate individuals, the results were mostly attenuated. So in summary, our study did not find evidence for a cognitive advantage among either urban or rural dwelling bilingual adults. And this is mostly consistent with other population-based studies that multilingualism is not found to be associated with cognitive functioning across the lifespan. And this research is still budding among other lower and middle income countries. And one of the reasons why it's inconsistent with the studies that do find an advantage is that those studies are typically clinic-based or retrospective and less likely to be population representative. We also saw that, again, the Spanish indigenous bilingual adults in rural settings had worse cognitive performance. And this is suggesting that possibly this classification of Spanish indigenous bilingualism is a proxy for sociocultural factors related to indigeneity, rather than, we're picking up on neural mechanisms here. And this is further kind of shown by our exploratory analyses that looked at, incorporated the literacy rates that were lowest among this group. And it suggests that perhaps illiterate adults, whether you're bilingual or monolingual, you're more alike in your life course exposures. And literacy in the majority language of the nation is going to offer a greater benefit for those who are non-indigenous compared to those who are already disadvantaged socially. And so we do have some limitations as well as future directions. All of our participants were tested in Spanish. It would be great if we could test everybody in the 68 indigenous languages, but that's not very realistic. And it's also important because we're unable to determine if participants would have performed better on some of the cognitive tasks if they were tested in their indigenous language. And there's some evidence to suggest that having some degree of Spanish proficiency, having that marker, that's also related to better cognitive performance in the tested language. Currently, we lack detailed language characteristic information, so things like age of acquisition of their second language, how often are they using their languages, in what contexts, and all of this information is really important to better characterize our bilingual groups across all of the languages that they speak. This work is being implemented in future waves, so we're hoping to incorporate that when we look at wave 2 and then also cognitive decline. Similarly, we lack detailed indigeneity data. Although indigenous communities across Mexico share a history of unequal treatment, they're not homogeneous. There's variety in geographic distribution, degree of displacement, exposure to urbanization, gentrification, internal migration, all different social determinants that might impact cognitive aging in different ways for this group. The thing is, indigenous groups are largely invisible in cognitive aging research, and so I hope that our work underscores the importance of considering context-specific and sociocultural factors related to bilingualism and of including indigenous individuals in studies of aging. So with that, I'd like to thank MHAS and MEXCOG participants and staff, my co-authors for this work that's under review, my mentor, Dr. Arce Renteria in the MAR Lab, as well as funding sources and for the invitation to speak with you all today. Gracias.